Everybody's got to bear with me. This takes a minute or two. If you think of the human psyche, we got the ego, which is like a little black dot in the middle of a greater thing that we would call the self, like the Jungian self with a capital S. And the self contains the collective unconscious, all the aspects of the unconscious, right? The hero's journey, the archetypes of the unconscious, all of the sort of intuitive stuff, right? When you, I would imagine, come up with great comedy material or any kind of material, it's coming from that self, coming from that deeper place, right? And even when Jung or Joseph Campbell describe the self, I have a little diagram in the War of Art where adjacent to this larger self, they'd have like 3 arrows, and the arrows are coming from what they call the divine ground, which I take to mean whatever greater force is out there, that will come to you. So this is a long way of saying that the ego, which is, right, your I part, the part that identifies with this body and with the ego wants to be in control, right? The ego is where you drive down to the store, you get it, whatever it is, right? But when you're trying to tap into that greater intelligence, like if you're writing, if you're trying to come up to, if you're a musician, if you're any kind of creative person, you're trying to surrender to that self, to that greater self. And I feel like the ego hates that. The ego knows if you make that shift to identify with that greater self, then the ego is out of business. So I think, this is my theory, that the ego produces resistance to try to stop you from connecting and trusting and believing, because it is a leap of faith, right, to get to that other level, wherever it is. So the ego says to you, who do you think you are to try to tap into that thing? Who do you think you are to come up with this idea? It's been done 1,000,000 times better than you'll ever do it. You don't have the chops to do this. You're going to fall on your ass, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or let me distract you. Why don't we chase some women? Why don't we get drunk? Why don't we hang out with our buddies? Whatever it is. But so I think that what the ego wants is to maintain its control, right? And if you make that shift into that greater self, that's when you really are starting to tap into great stuff. That's where the great stuff comes from. Yeah. Right? And that puts the ego out of a job. At least this is my theory, Joe. So I think that the ego produces it. I mean, it's interesting, sort of animals don't experience resistance. I'm sure they don't, right?
Right, but they also don't really experience creativity.
True. But they're in that greater world, I think, naturally,
Right.
They're
free.
They're in that God energy, An eagle or somebody that's flying, you watch like the tiniest little wings or feathers even, control it. They're not thinking about anything, right? When they're hunting or whatever it is. So anyway, that's my theory on what resistance is. Now, Seth Godin, who he is. He's a believer that it's the
Who is Seth Godin? I do not know.
Seth Godin is a kind of a marketing guru, one of the earliest guys on the internet from way back when it first began, and is a great teacher of marketing and stuff like that, and also a wonderful guy in this areas in the sense that he is highly ethical dude. Like when he talks about businesses, startups, and all the things that he's kind of helping people with, ethics is a huge part of it. So I really respect the guy. And he's a great deep thinker too. Now he thinks it's what he calls the lizard brain, the amygdala, which I'm not even sure what that is. I guess it's the reptile brain at the back of your head, that's what's producing something. It wants producing resistance. But anyway, I respect his thinking on that, but I think it's what I just explained to you.
What you're saying makes a lot of sense. And the ego, whatever that thing is, that it's so interesting how it's not able to see that it would actually benefit the ego if you didn't have resistance.
Yes.
Which is really weird.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, because if the ego was wise and had like foresight, it could see the future, go, oh, if we just give in and relax and relinquish control, then we're going to come up with better stuff and our life's going to be better. Be able to buy a nicer house.
Yeah.
Maybe be able to go on trips. Your work will do well. Everything will be good.
it's a deep subject because also if you think about the ego's view of what life is, I'm going to go into some deep stuff here. You don't mind
You don't
this
have
stuff,
to
right?
clarify. Just
The
feel
ego
free.
has a whole view. The ego believes that this material world is all there is, right?
Yeah.
The ego believes in death. The ego believes that when this body dies, we die, right? The ego believes that this flesh can be hurt, can be maimed, can be broken, et cetera, et cetera. So the ego naturally lives in fear. I think that the predominant emotion of the ego, if we're living in the ego, which is 99% of people do, our predominant emotion is fear, right? And fear, even though we might not know it, fear of death, which is kind of why people want to achieve, I think, right? Let me make a name for myself, blah, blah, blah. Why people want to have children will live on, why they have insurance, why they try to succeed and have a big house and this and that and the other thing, right? That's all sort of coming out of a mindset of fear. Whereas this giant self, in my opinion, the bigger self that is connected to the thing, its predominant emotion is love, if you ask me. Now, the ego, another thing the ego believes is that I am separate from you, right? We are all separate individuals, right? I could hurt you and it won't hurt me. That's what the ego thinks, right? That's why so much of the evil that happens in the world comes out of that, right? We can torture these sons of bitches and it won't happen to us, right? Nothing bad will happen to us. But the self believes exactly the opposite. Once you get into that deep level, right, that we are not separate from one another, that you and I are bound together in some kind of way along with all of humanity and all of the animal life and all of the planet, all of the oceans and all of that. And so the predominant emotion in that self is the emotion of love. So the ego, this is my belief anyway, the ego being centered in fear is going to try to hang on to what it's got, right? If the ego thinks that it's living our life, it's calling the shots, it's going to hang on to that, out of fear, and won't. That's why I think it's so strong. Resistance is so strong. When the closer you get to moving into that self, into that greater space, like if you're sitting down and trying to write a novel, and you get into a kind of a flow of it, that's what the ego is really afraid of, because it's such a kind of empowering and intoxicating experience. The ego says to itself, shit, if this guy stays over here very long, he's never going to go back to, to where I pull the call